The goal of this video is to illustrate for you how we know that language is seated in the left hemisphere of the brain for about 90% of the human population. Those are typically those people who are right-handed. For people who are left-handed, language often appears in the right hemisphere. Going back to the 1940s and 50s, Dr. Wilder Penfield was an early neurosurgeon who used to perform surgeries on patients in order to correct problems like epilepsy, which was recurrent seizures. If Dr. Wilder Penfield could identify areas of the brain that were kind of the originating epicenter, the genesis of the seizures, then he would be able to remove those parts from the brain and cure or strongly abate the seizures so that they didn't happen as much. But in order to be safe, Dr. Penfield had to ensure that he wasn't going to remove some really necessary, indispensable part of the brain. You could imagine, for instance, that if he took out the occipital lobe, all of a sudden people wouldn't be able to see. If he took out some part of the motor cortex, then somebody would be paralyzed. And if he took out part of the language processing areas of the brain, then people would be incapable of producing or understanding language. Now, the way he would go about doing this is he would open up people's scalps before surgery, open up their skull, and use an electrical probe to dig around in their cortex and stimulate different parts of the brain. And when he stimulated Broca's and Wernicke's areas, he often found that it interfered with language production or comprehension. He did find a lot of variability in the locations of these two areas, a surprising amount given that this was early in our understanding of functional neurology, and so it was not well understood at that point that even though you might find that a particular brain region might be responsible for something in one person, that it might not be that exact same spot in another person. It might be much further towards the back of the head or much closer to the front of the head in another individual. So, on average, Broca's and Wernicke's areas are where they're mapped out in the text in those images. But you're going to find a lot of variability across patients. The thing that surprised Dr. Penfield, though, was that language was in the left hemisphere for about 90% of his patients. Now, I want to talk for a minute about how Penfield knew that the language centers of the brain were in the left hemisphere. You have to understand that he was using a very mild electrical stimulation. For instance, if he were to stimulate the sensory cortex of the brain, it caused merely just a mild tingling, like in the fingertips or the thumb. If he were to stimulate the language centers, he didn't cause the person to just start spouting out random words. Instead, it actually turned off the capacity for language. Now, that might be a little bit counterintuitive, but you have to remember that neurons can either be excitatory or inhibitory. And when they're activated, they can either cause you to do something or cause you not to do something. And as we saw in a previous video, where an individual was stimulated with what's called a transcranial magnetic stimulation, a TMS, placed over their language center, it shut off the capacity for language, even though it was being stimulated. It didn't shut off the capacity for that individual to sing, but it did inhibit their ability to speak. So when Penfield was trying to figure out exactly where the language centers were so that he didn't accidentally cut them out, he would stimulate around these areas, and the individual was unable to answer the doctor's questions. So you could see then that that meant that he was incapacitating their linguistic capabilities. But this raises the interesting question, what might be happening on the right hemisphere of the brain in those same areas where Wernicke's and Broca's areas would be if there were language centers? The first thing I want to talk about is Broca's area. Broca's area in the right hemisphere appears to actually be involved in some language processing, but only under duress. For instance, when individuals when they undergo a stroke or have a hemispherectomy, where like half of their brain is removed for some reason, the Broca's area in the right hemisphere kind of takes over in understanding language. It enables the person to right away process, hear, understand what people are saying to them. So even if somebody has a stroke, they usually can still continue to understand what others are saying to them. They just can't respond in return. And this happens even if Broca's area and Wernicke's area are incapacitated in the left hemisphere. It seems like the right Broca's area kind of takes over under emergency circumstances. Now, this is not actually that surprising because almost all functions in the brain are bilateral, meaning there's a backup for whatever we're doing on the other side of the brain, so that if the brain is damaged in one hemisphere, the other hemisphere of the brain can take over that function and deal with the tasks that are requiring done. Okay, so then one might ask, okay, what's happening in Wernicke's area? Can this take over under emergency circumstances? And the answer to that question is, surprisingly, no. If you are a stroke patient and you experience damage to Wernicke's area, there's basically no backup. You can't still continue to speak to people. Why might this be? If all the other functions of the brain are mediated bilaterally, and there's backup so that if one side is damaged, then the other side can kind of take over. Why is that not the case with something so important, so critical as language? Well, some of the answers might come out from a little bit of what Penfield did discover, and from some findings we'll discuss later. When Penfield would stimulate Wernicke's area here in the right hemisphere, he would create in his patients hallucinations of voices. Sometimes they were garbled, mumbling. Sometimes they were clear. Sometimes they were the voice of a relative. Sometimes they were the voice of a stranger. They might even, from time to time, be accompanied by a visual hallucination. They might see an individual, somebody they do or don't know, standing across the room, for instance, from them. When the patients were younger, like in their 20s, the hallucinations were more vivid and admonishing. The voices would tell them to do something, would kind of command them. And surprisingly, these hallucinations lasted a very long time. If Penfield would stimulate this area for just 2 seconds, the hallucination, the voice that they're hearing in their mind, would continue for 20 seconds sometimes. All of these voices that they were experiencing in the right hemisphere, when the Wernicke's area in the right hemisphere was stimulated, were experienced as an other person, never themselves. It was never their own voice, never their own internal dialogue, or monologue, I mean. And interestingly, they never experienced other kinds of self-initiated things. They never felt themselves eating or running or talking, but they could experience those things when stimulated elsewhere. So what is going on here? Julian Jaynes, preeminent theoretician and psychologist and linguist in the 1970s, hypothesized a fascinating explanation here that historically, anciently, there were language centers in both hemispheres of the brain. It was bilaterally mediated, and if one side got damaged, then the other side could kind of take over. But there were problems that were caused by having language centers in both hemispheres of the brain. Today, what's going on in the right hemisphere of the brain is mostly outside of our awareness. Our sense of self is mostly in the left hemisphere of the brain. Everything we're conscious of, everything that's us, is kind of happening over here. And we'll talk in a moment about a kind of surgery that splits the two hemispheres of the brain and highlights how this happens for us. But for now, I just want to suggest that in ancient times, when the Wright Wernicke's language area here might have been active. It could have been experienced as verbal hallucinations in all of the human population. In essence, every person would have been schizophrenic. They would have all experienced verbal hallucinations of other people's voices going on in their brain, telling them what they should do. Jaynes hypothesizes that before the human species became conscious, we did have the capacity for language, and that the capacity for consciousness kind of came a little bit later in our evolutionary trajectory. But that in the time between when language arose and consciousness arose, people would have this voice that was originating from a language center in their brain, but experienced as if it were an other person's voice, telling them what to do. And you can see in ancient literature how, in like Greek mythology, for instance, people describe that the gods would speak to their minds and tell them what to do. And it seems like, perhaps, one explanation for why this is going on so frequently in the ancient times, in the ancient literature, is that we did have language centers in both hemispheres of the brain. In the left, for our own language, and in the right, for a kind of planning, processing, and directing of what we were supposed to be doing. And that the language centers in the right hemisphere would direct us to engage in certain behaviors, and that those voices would be heard in the Broca's area of the left hemisphere, processed and understood, and that we would integrate it into our sense of self as if it were an external voice, even though it was actually originating from the person's own brain. Another piece of evidence comes from this procedure called a colossotomy. This is a kind of procedure where, again, neurosurgeons are trying to correct for epilepsy or repeated seizures by stopping the spread from going across both hemispheres. If you can keep a seizure located in one half of the brain, then the effect of that seizure in the individual will be significantly reduced. So one attempt at treating this problem looks like this. You've got two hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right. And this is, of course, a top view. This is what it's called a transverse plane. And this right here is a side view. And you can see that this side view is actually taken exactly down the middle. So if you just imagine cutting right here, exactly down the middle of the brain, this is what you'd open up if you were to turn the brain to its side. And here, this little patch of white fiber is a connection, a bundle of neurons that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together. So this section right here is the same as this section right here. This is called the corpus callosum, and it's designed to connect the two hemispheres so that they can communicate back and forth to each other. But in order to stop the spread of the seizures, one procedure, as I told you, is a colossotomy, where you try to you separate the two hemispheres of the brain. So some neurosurgeon might come in here, and they might come along and ablate or cause a lesion, damage the neurons, all the way down the length of the corpus callosum. So this is illustrating here. You start at the front, and you kind of just come back, and you just use different surgeons will use different techniques. You might use a knife or a laser or something like that to damage the neurons. And you come back here, and you just are killing off all these connective tissues that are keeping together the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, of course, this was piloted in monkeys first, and it was surprisingly, it would be effective for treating different kinds of things, but it didn't seem to impact the monkeys' behavior or their ability to survive, live, and act in ordinary ways. That was really surprising. And indeed, when it was originally pioneered in humans, the same thing was found, that it had very little impact on humans' day-to-day living. However, there were some interesting side effects that you could discover if you designed a very clever experience experiment and probed about those kinds of things. So here's an example. This is a split brain patient here, illustrated, where they have had their corpus callosum severed, and they have here a blinder so that they can't see what's behind the blinder. There's just a series of objects, and they might reach their hand underneath, and in different versions of the experiment, they'll use either their left hand or their right hand. Now, you have to understand something fascinating about the brain. The right hand is connected up through and to the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain controls this right hand and receives sensory input from it. It then, if your brain is fully intact, will communicate that information over to the right hemisphere of the brain through the corpus callosum. But if that part of the brain has been severed, like it has in this patient, then the information from the right hand will go up to the left hemisphere, and then it will stay there and not be communicated to the right hemisphere. So this patient here would be able to use his right hand to feel an object, and because that information is sent up to the left hemisphere, he would be able to say with a word what he was touching, if it was a ball or a key or a pencil or whatever it was. However, if he used his left hand, the left information would come up to the right hemisphere of the brain, and it would not transfer over to the left hemisphere, which means that the language hemisphere, the left hemisphere of this patient's brain, would not know the word for what he was touching. This patient could not communicate using words what he was touching, even though a half of his brain, the hidden secret half that doesn't have language, would actually know what he was touching. It just wouldn't be able to communicate it. So you might ask this patient, well, then draw a picture of what you're holding. And with his left hand, he would be able to draw a picture. But if you asked him to draw a picture with his right hand, or to write a word with his right hand, he wouldn't be able to do that because his right hand has no access to the information that's held by the right hemisphere, because it only knows what's in the left hemisphere. In another version of this experiment, it was strictly a visual task. In order to understand that, I have to give you a little bit of an introduction to what how the visual system of the brain works. We have color-coded here the left visual field as red and the right visual field as kind of a green-teal color. You can see that in each eye, both visual fields are represented. So in the left eye, the back of the eye represents, on the left side, the right visual field. You can see that the information right here in this triangle, this is the area of the visual field that is transposed onto the back of the eye. And on the right side of the eye, the left visual field is translated. So you can see you've got this triangle worth of stuff right here that is transposed onto the back of the right side of the eye. And not through the corpus callosum, but through what's called the optic chiasm, this information is then sent back to either the left or the right hemisphere. The information from the left visual field, this red area, is sent back across the optic chiasm to the right primary visual cortex. This is the back of the brain where our visual information is processed. The information from the right visual field, this blue-green color here, this is processed down and doesn't cross the optic chiasm on this eye and processes back to the left hemisphere of the brain. But the opposite is true of the right eye. You can see that here the right visual field does cross the optic chiasm, and the left visual field does not cross the optic chiasm and is processed in the same hemisphere of the brain. Okay, with that piece of background information, we can then say that what happens with the information from there is the primary visual cortex sends the information to other cortical regions, higher order processing in the brain, and you're able to connect it with words, and you're able to connect it with memories, and you're able to think about how that object would be manipulated or used in a real life environment. that information is passed across the two hemispheres using the corpus callosum. So this right here, this optic chiasm, is not part of the corpus callosum. It's much further down in the brain than the corpus callosum. To go back one slide, or 2 slides, I'll show you here that the optic chiasm is actually somewhere near here in the center of the brain. So the corpus callosum is just this white part right here that ended up getting severed by the neurosurgeons. So this part of the brain was still able to cross over. Other experiments on split brain patients were strictly visual in nature. In order to understand how these worked, I'll just show you first that this is a schematic of an ordinary individual, a normal individual who has their corpus callosum intact. This is represented by the dark bundle of nerves here between the two hemispheres of the brain. But people who were split brain are going to be represented in this schema by the lack of that corpus callosum. So you can see that it's like a light line between the hemispheres of the brain. So a normal individual would see a picture flashed in the left visual field. That would be processed by the back of the eye here on the right side. It would, of course, go across the optic chiasm, not the corpus callosum, the optic chiasm, and be processed back to the right visual cortex. Because the corpus callosum is intact here, that information can then be shared with the left visual cortex, and from there it's sent to the language centers, like Broca's area, and the individual can process what it was they saw. In linguistic terms, they process the picture back here, but they process the language up here, and they're able to verbalize that what they saw was a key. Individuals who have undergone a split brain procedure, however, see the same object in their left visual field. The information is processed over the optic chiasm and comes back here to the right visual cortex. But because the corpus callosum has been severed, that information stops there. It cannot be processed to the left visual cortex, and therefore it cannot reach the language centers in the left hemisphere of the brain. So if you ask that individual, what did you see? They will say, I don't know. But if you show them the picture in their right visual field, then that information will be processed on the left side of the eye. It will be processed back to the right visual cortex, to the left visual cortex, which will, of course, reach their language centers, and they will be able to verbalize, oh, I saw a key. Interestingly, in these kinds of verbal conditions right here, where individuals didn't know what they had seen, they would still be able to draw a picture of what they'd seen. They wouldn't be able to write out the word because the language centers on this side do not allow the capacity to write out words, but they're pictorially skilled and could draw a picture of a key. Now, the fact that these individuals had no capacity to be able to verbalize anything that was going on in this hemisphere of the brain results in some very fascinating findings. For instance, if you probe a little bit about what people experience right after their split brain procedures, sometimes they say that it's almost as if their two hands are operating in independence of each other. So like sometimes they'll go to their wardrobe, they'll see a couple of different shirts there, and each hand will reach for a different shirt. They'll have to take their right hand and grab their left hand and force that hand to put back the shirt that it has, because of course that's not the shirt I actually want to wear. Now, how does the individual know which shirt they want to wear? Both hands want a different shirt. So how do they know which one is the them? Well, remember, what's going on in the left hemisphere of the brain is the language centers, and the sense of self is here because we think the language centers are there. And so with that sense of self comes a particular identity, and whatever's going on in the right hemisphere, whatever's going on the right side of the body, that right hand, that's the shirt that this person really wants to wear. And what's going on in the left side is indeed actually them, a half of them. But what's going on that side is not privy to their conscious self. They are not aware of what's going on there because it's not being integrated with their consciousness located in the left hemisphere of the brain. You can also ask split brain patients if they believe in God, for instance. And sometimes they will report with their their verbal response will be, yes, of course I believe in God. But if you ask the left hand to point on a chart to whether they believe in God or not, yes or no, it might point to the word no, suggesting that one half of their brain, one hemisphere of their brain, living inside them, a latent personality, a character that is separate from themselves, doesn't believe in God. So then you have to, ask the existential question, of course, what happens when this person dies? Does the left hemisphere of their brain go to heaven and the right hemisphere goes to hell or something? It's just fascinating. But the reason why I'm delving into these idiosyncrasies of a split brain patient is again to suggest that, of course, this is the second piece of evidence that we've seen that the language centers are in the left hemisphere of the brain, but it also further supports our idea that if we had language centers also on the right hemisphere of the brain, they would not be associated with our sense of self. It would feel as if an alternate person, separate from ourselves, were talking to us. And when those verbs when those verbal communications were processed to the left hemisphere of the brain, it would be almost as if we were hearing a voice inside ourselves that wasn't us, and it would be speaking to us. If that were the case, evolutionarily, historically, if human beings ever had that occurring, it could be interpreted as disadvantageous to basically be hallucinating other individuals telling you what to do from day to day. And it would be eventually beneficial to kind of shut that down and stop processing language in the right hemisphere of the brain, which would then result in kind of a nonsense area, a vestigial area of the brain that wasn't needed for anything in particular. But if Penfield, for instance, would stimulate that area artificially, then you could see that there was kind of a vestigial language processing going on, but that those were hallucinated feelings of voices. Thus, in order to retain a single, coherent, subvocal, logical narrative, it may have been advantageous historically for us to shut off the language center on the right hemisphere of the brain, to deactivate that and allow for our language centers in the left hemisphere to become our primary or sole language centers. That way we wouldn't have conflicting voices, our own and a feeling of another's, speaking to us in our own mind, but we would be able to think in a more linear fashion and kind of own our own subvocal identity. Now, what I've just described is true of the 90% of the population who are right-handed. However, there are a 10% of the population who are left-handed, and left-handed individuals are more likely to have their language centers are uncertain. Each individual who is left-handed could have their language centers in the left hemisphere or in the right hemisphere. It's kind of like a coin toss. And sometimes they actually are in both hemispheres. And individuals who have their language centers in both hemispheres are more likely to hear hallucinated voices. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're at the level of a schizophrenic individual who hears them frequently, but they might hear them intermittently. It might be, for instance, experienced as the voice of a relative who has passed on. And this relative might, say things to them from time to time. They might be admonishing things, kind of telling them what to do, directing them, giving them guidance. And some people will experience it quite frequently, and some people less frequently. But it won't be to the point where it's distracting from their daily life. They're able to function. However, people with schizophrenia are far more likely to be left-handed and to have language centers in both hemispheres of the brain. And this suggests that, again, if you are having these additional language centers activated, then you're more likely to have dissociated external other language speaking at you, even though it's arising from your own mind. And this, of course, in today's society is disadvantageous because it leads to people thinking that that you're crazy. But in an evolutionary environment where this was more prevalent, it's possible that people who were more in touch with their other voice, their external voice, were actually better respected because these other voices would direct them and give them guidance, and perhaps be associated with ancestors who had passed on, or with godlike figures that would kind of help them to know what they were supposed to be doing in life and give them additional strength beyond their own and additional guidance beyond their own. And so while disadvantageous in today's environment, historically it may have been it may have been a mixed bag. Sometimes it might have been disadvantageous and sometimes advantageous. But anyway, I guess what I'm saying here is that this is one theory, one hypothesis for how it could have been that that the right hemisphere of the brain would have historically had the language centers present, but today would not have any language centers activated.